God we will follow.
Welcome to a presentation on depression given at the Stephen Ministry Workshop at Trinity Lutheran Church. Stephen Ministry is a service that trains lay people how to work with people with problems and challenges in their life on a one-to-one basis, bringing God to them in person. Today we have a panel of three people for our depression discussion. At my far right is Brenda Consorto, who is my Associate Director of Stephen Ministry. My name is Bill Rarig. I'm Director of Stephen Ministry. And our special honored intelligent guest is Dr. Kendra O'Hora, who will introduce herself.
Perfect. Thank you. Yes, so I'm Dr. Kendra O'Hora. I'm a licensed clinical marriage and family therapist. I own a practice in Harford County called Harco MFT and Wellness Center. I have a lovely business partner who works with trauma and clients, but I do a lot of couples therapy, working with marriages and helping couples grow to be the best that they can be. So thanks for having me today.
Oh, you're quite welcome. So, doctor, what exactly is depression?
So from a therapeutic sense, we define depression as having prolonged symptom development. So what you normally see in someone is that their depression lasts for over 2 weeks, and they have typical symptoms like loss of appetite, loss of interest in pleasurable activities, a disinterest in sex or connection. It could also be a weight gain or weight loss unrelated to dietary changes. So a lot of times what you see with depression is just essentially sadness, prolonged sadness that links up with a lot of those symptoms, feelings of worthlessness, or even thoughts of suicide.
Thank you. Now, as I've lived my life, I have heard about people that are clinically depressed. How is that different?
That's a good question. So from a pop culture sense, we use the word depression probably a little bit too much. In some ways we use it even in passing terms or as a joke. And so in the therapy world, we use clinical depression to mean an actual diagnosis, which means that someone has gone to a therapist or a psychiatrist and they've been diagnosed. In the depression world, clinical depression falls into what we call major depressive disorder. And that's essentially just the fancy term for depression. And someone can have major depressive disorder in a mild form or a severe form. And they can also have other symptoms. For example, they could have delusions, hallucinations, other things could go along with that diagnosis. So the short answer is that depression in our culture is just essentially someone who's really sad, where clinical depression is an actual diagnosis where someone has met all of the criteria and stipulations for depression.
What happens to a person who meets your depression definition of 2 weeks that is not treated or in some way helped through that?
So best case scenario is someone who's diagnosed, who's not treated, will slowly recover on their own. Worst case scenario is suicide or loss. So obviously depression is a really important thing to tackle because you just never know what could happen to someone. We tackle it in a lot of different ways in the therapy world. We use talk therapy, sometimes medication if it's relevant. Certainly the services that you guys are providing are things that aid and assist people in feeling supported and loved in times when they're hurting. So the spectrum is pretty wide as to what could happen.
Now, somebody that's depressed became that way because of some loss of some kind in their life, some disappointment, some perceived failure. Is working with that trigger part of your therapy?
Yes, absolutely. We do a lot of work that gets to the root of things. Good.
We Stephen ministers see people on about a once-a-week basis. And for many of these, especially the older folks, we might be the only person to walk into that home that's not a family member.
Mm-hmm.
So if a person is depressed, in some sense of the definition, our appearance is a bright, shining sunrise in that person's life for an hour or so. there they put a different mask on. So, what are some of the clues that we can look for that might tell us that this person might be depressed in spite of their, in a sense, not genuine happiness?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a really good question. So first I want to differentiate between grief and depression, because these are two different things. Grief is a really common process that anybody would go through when they've experienced loss of any type. So it could be loss in the form of death, but it could also be loss as far as a move or job loss or a transition that the family's gone through. Grief, again, is a very common process and just involves feelings of sadness or just being out of sorts, disconnected. A lot of times people who experience grief just feel a little isolated and alone, and a common thing that you can look for or differentiate between grief and depression is waves. So with grief, you often have waves where people feel sad, confused, alone, and then waves where they feel memories, joy, happiness, and they're able to kind of channel those things. With depression, you see a pretty steady trajectory. So that would be the first thing that I would look for is the person experiencing the waves? If so, that's probably a fairly normal grief process. If not, then they're likely experiencing depression or something more severe. Another thing that I would look for is feelings of worthlessness. So often with grief, you don't see feelings of worthlessness or low self-esteem. You just see someone who's adjusting to a transition that they weren't expecting. But with depression, you often have feelings of worthlessness or low self-worth associated with the process. So those would be two things right off the bat that you can look for in someone to determine, is it grief or is it depression?
And if we, Dr. O'Hara, if we start seeing that when we're visiting our care receivers, when we identify that you're more in that clinical depressive state versus just the normal grief or depressed societal term of it, what steps do we need to take to help the person once we've identified that we may be dealing with a bigger issue?
Yeah. Well, first, the work that's already being done is so valuable because, like you said, just being with people when they're hurting, whether that's grief or depression, is key. That's super crucial. So as far as next steps that are more tangible or practical, there's so many. There's hundreds. I could talk for hours about it. But I think a first thing to look out for and to be mindful of is how you're communicating, the language you're using. So what I often recommend when I work with people who are assisting or helping in any way is that you be really mindful of your language. Right? So those Christian cliches that we think are helpful are often really invalidating to someone who's experiencing depression or grief. So we need to be mindful of that. We need to not say, they're in a better place and things like that. Some people respond well to that, but most people just feel kind of stuck when they hear those types of things. We want to use really validating language, and I'm sure that's already happening, but one of the things that you can do when someone's sharing is repeat back to them what you're hearing and let them know that you're engaged by having empathy and support. So those are kind of some frontline practical ways. Obviously, take suicidality very seriously. So most people feel afraid to talk about suicide, and that's actually the worst thing that you can do is hide from it or avoid it. What someone often needs when they're expressing suicidality is an honest conversation. So you would want to assess for it. Obviously, you could refer them to someone else, like the Harford County Mobile Crisis Unit or to 911 or the ER. But in the moment, you can assess. You can actually ask someone on a scale of 1 to 10, how likely do you feel like you're going to execute your plan today? And I know that can sound like a really scary question to ask someone, but it's actually a really helpful tool. You can assess by asking someone, do they have a plan? Have they thought about executing the plan? And then do that scale. How likely are they? So someone that's in the 1 to 5 range they're thinking about it because they're hurting, but they're not necessarily ready to take steps. So those would be things: empathy and validation, being mindful of your language, and then taking suicidality very seriously are kind of the things that I throw at people right away when you're thinking about walking through depression or grief with someone. That's a good question.
I had an experience that really ties into what you just said. This goes back before I was married, which means it's a long time ago. And a friend of mine who was in his 50s came and said, "What are you doing?" And I said, "Nothing." He says, "Come on, let's go for a beer." Well, I don't drink beer, so I got a Coke. And we were in this place, and on the other side of this gentleman was a young kid with a hat on. And he began talking to this kid and ignoring me. And I overheard the conversation, and this kid was saying to this friend of mine, this was down at the beach, "This is my last beer. And when I get done, I'm walking straight down that road to the beach. I'm going to walk right in the ocean, and I'm going to walk till my hat floats, and that's it. I'm done with life." And this friend of mine kept asking him one question: "Tell me more." After every statement he made, he said, "Okay, tell me more." And when this conversation was done, this kid said, "You know what? I'm going back home. I'm going to straighten things out with my wife and my parents, and I'm going to try and do this." So talking really helps, because a lot of times I would think suicidal people just don't see the total picture. And they focus on some really, in their mind, damning negative thing, which seems to override everything else. And, it's time to check out, which is wrong. Now, as we see these people every week, are there some things that we can suggest to these people that they can do in our absence that they can then share with us the next week as a, not homework, but as a bridge between our visits?
Yeah, I love that. I feel like, honestly, we could talk about suggestions and what to offer people for hours. So what I will do is explain briefly a little bit about my research. So prior to becoming a therapist, what my research was, so that you guys can have some context as to what some really healthy next steps are. And I'll make it short because the dissertation is way too long. So essentially what I did was I interviewed older adults as they transitioned into assisted living. So these were people who had just experienced some form of loss or transition. It could be a medical transition or a health crisis that prompted them to need to go to assisted living. And often that transition itself involved a ton of grief and a lot of isolation. So a lot of the older adults that I worked with, they felt disconnected from their families. They felt like they were in a foreign environment. There was a lot that was stirred up in that process. And so I did some really cool things. I scaled them all on their depression. I scaled them all on their loneliness and their social isolation. And then I did what we call a reminiscence intervention. And so I did this intervention that was essentially a family life review. And so I brought in the children or the grandchildren or a close family friend, and we did this 1.5 hour long to 2 hour conversation that was all about their life story. So similar to this tell me more mentality. I worked with the families and just had them share anything and everything they had been through. I worked with a list of historical events, so they could be pop culture events or events that had happened in history. And then afterwards, I came back about a month later, a month to 6 weeks, and I did some follow-up interviews where I asked them, what did that mean to you? How did it feel to tell your life story? What did it mean to connect? And it was pretty remarkable what we found. So I think that this actually ties in pretty well, because what I found in my research was that families want to be connected. They want to be connected to each other. They want to be connected to their legacy and their story. So one of the best things you can do is engage people in finding ways to tell their story. And there are so many tools out there as to how you can do that. So there's stuff online. I'm happy to share my list of historical events, but there are cards, index cards, that you can have people look at and play games as to sharing parts of their life story. There are memory books where you can gift a family member. I've gifted some of my family members a memory book where they write down their legacy and their story and significant events that they've gone through. So I think starting with that and engaging people in this is a long-term process. So when you meet with them, just start small, like tell me a memory from your childhood, or tell me how did your family vacation growing up, or what are some of the things that you're most proud of? Tell me that first car that you had. Engaging them in storytelling and having them, if possible, write it down or put pictures to the stories helps them create something that they can give on to the next generation that they're proud of. And for a lot of people, that helps pull them out of that depression because, like you mentioned, they have a lot of tunnel vision, right? They get stuck on those pain points and they often feel disconnected from the rest of the picture, the world. So connecting them to their legacy helps pull them up out of that to feel like they're worthwhile, like they have a place.
In your practice and research, have you found any noticeable difference in the way people of faith respond to being depressed versus those who are not of faith?
That's actually like a really difficult and taboo topic to talk about. So I'm happy to answer, but be mindful that the answer is different depending on who you ask. In my opinion, I actually feel like people of faith respond more difficultly to a diagnosis of depression. I think in some ways our culture validates mental health a little bit more fluidly than the church has. And so what I've seen over time is that the church carries a stigma that they feel like you could pray away your depression, or they feel like you, if you were more faithful, you wouldn't be having this, or God doesn't bless you or love you if you have depression. And so I've actually found it challenging because a lot of people that I work with who have a faith background, they feel like something is wrong with them and that the resources that are available are not, they're not right or they're not holy.
Yeah. And that's a big problem, because there are those who feel that they should be with God, self-sufficient, don't need help, to the point where even some faiths talk about God healing their physical ills, which we know doesn't work all the time. So I think the big challenge, though, for a person of faith is wondering if the person they go to is also of faith as a therapist. And that's something that's, I guess, important to think about. But, you know, we talk a lot about God leading us. And if somebody is depressed and they finally decide that a counselor or a psychologist or a therapist is what's in order, somehow they're led to that person. And, you know, God gets glory even from the heathen. And a lot of times heathen people do great things with people of faith who have problems. And it's a situation where every one of us is the temple of the Lord, because we have the Holy Spirit in us. And so, that being true, if the Lord leads you to do this or that about a human problem that's occurred in your life, then you have to go for it. And I think we as Stephen ministers have to champion that outlook, because the person that is faith closed, in other words, won't go beyond their faith in a sense that it would help to go outside their faith, personal faith, they're really not going to be as good and effective to do God's work as they would be if they go out and get whatever situation there is taken care of. And, you know, I know you as a therapist in a general practice, you don't look at your client and say, well, you go to church? And if the person says yes, you say, oh boy, you're going to be tough. You have to meet people where they are and deal with them and treat them that way. And I would imagine that your faith plays a big role in how you work with people, because the difference between a good therapist, in my view, and an ordinary therapist is the good therapist treats people. An ordinary therapist treats a condition, and that sort of dehumanizes it.
One thing that I like to explain to people, even though I work with couples who are going through transition or loss or have experienced a betrayal, there's a lot of similarity. And one of the things that I think we have been miseducated on are the stages of grief. So have you heard that language before, stages of grief?
Yeah,
Yes.
there's 7 of them.
Yes. So we know now through research and through a lot of experience that there is not a linear stage of grief. And so a lot of times when I work with people, they think, well, I'm still in the beginning. I'm in that anger or the depression or the bargaining phase. And what we know is that grief is more of like spaghetti. It's all over the place. And you guys are probably familiar with that. But it's very common for someone to go from anger to depression, back to anger, to bargaining, to feeling overwhelmed or sad, to feeling like they need to make some changes or acceptance. So that's a big piece that I like to emphasize when you're working with people is it's not regression for someone to go back. It actually is really healthy if someone's moving. If you see someone sticking in a stage of grief for an extended period of time, you might help them try to move on to some other categories. Again, it doesn't matter the type of movement, just that they start to consider other frameworks or perspectives that they could take in. So for example, if someone's stuck in that anger phase, you could talk with them a little bit about other times in their life when they've been able to make peace with something, just to get them thinking about what would acceptance look like, what would peace look like. And often from there, conversation can flow. So that's a big thing that I like to emphasize is just stages of grief aren't as linear or rigid as they used to be. They're a little bit more messy than that. Another thing that can contribute to someone's and this is kind of a personal example too, but another thing that can contribute to people feeling depressed or experiencing grief is being overwhelmed with care or planning arrangements. So a lot of times we get uncomfortable around concepts of death and talking about choices and what next steps and wills and life insurance and all of that stuff. And so a lot of families don't have those arrangements in place. And it's not uncommon when someone loses someone to feel very overwhelmed with how am I going to pay the mortgage, or when does my life insurance policy come through, or I need to submit all of these taxes and I'm overwhelmed because I wasn't the one who would do this stuff. So a practical, tangible thing you can do is offer the people that you work with resources. If you guys have a resource list of lawyers or therapists or people in the community that can support them in their care planning, whether that's through the hospital or nonprofit organizations, that can help a lot of people in between visits because their actual arrangements are being tackled. Sometimes people get so overwhelmed by their grief or depression that they can't fill out the forms that they need to fill out, or they can't get themselves to go to the appointments they need to go to. So basic care planning can be really important in helping someone care for themselves. It's also really common in grief and depression for someone's own health to decrease. So I'm sure you've heard of stories of people who, when their spouse died, the other spouse died within 24 hours or 48 hours. And that's actually kind of a phenomenon in the research that's really interesting to therapists and to psychologists, is why when one spouse dies does the other die? And a big piece of that we know is that when someone loses someone, their own health is impacted. So often you'll find that people are more susceptible to a heart attack or a stroke or to concerns with their bodies. And so one thing you can do is also help people come up with a clear plan for how they're going to take care of themselves, how they're going to make it to their doctor's appointments, or make sure that they're eating the right things, drinking enough water, because in depression and grief, we often forget that our bodies need tended to. So that's an important thing that I love to touch on. And I know that your time is limited in the resources and things that you can do with people, but quality time is just really key. People just want to be around other people. They just don't want to be isolated or alone. So even if it's not you per se that's spending the time with them, since you're already doing that hour a week, helping them come up with a schedule of people who could spend time with them. So perhaps it's grandchildren or nieces and nephews or a neighbor, but having them have a schedule where at least once a day or once every other day they're connecting with someone. That could be something you could help organize. Another one that is really important in grief work, is celebration and honoring. And so that looks different for each person, but I often encourage people to think of a creative way that they could honor the loss of that person, or honor their birthday, or honor an anniversary. For some people, it's as simple as going to the graveside and putting flowers on the grave. For other people, it's letting a balloon or a lantern go in the sky. And so sometimes in the therapy world, we use the language of a ritual. If you have a ritual, something that you do every single year, it helps in the grieving process because you have an anchor point. And those anchor points are really helpful in healing. So you guys could probably think of rituals that you do, certain things you do around the holidays, Thanksgiving, Christmas, right? You get into these family traditions or rituals, and the grieving journey can benefit from these types of rituals as well. And so there's some of that stuff that we see at services or celebration of life services, but you want rituals to extend beyond that. You want to have the opportunity to honor that person's life, even outside of the day that they actually died, but honoring their birthday or honoring their anniversaries or things like that as well. So that's one that I like to encourage.
Speaking of celebration, one of the things that we as Stephen ministers get wrapped up in is seeing our care receiver every week, knowing the challenge they face, and every week as we go to them, we try and work a step or two at a time through that grief or depression or challenge or whatever. But one of the things that I want to ask you guys to do is, as you're working with your care receiver, you know that they're not done with the challenge. But as they walk through this and you see that they've made some progress, celebrate that. Let them know that there's a positive step being taken here. Mm-hmm. Because, positive feedback is the greatest thing in the world, as long as it's valid. And if we don't celebrate that, we're missing a chance to really give these people another solid block in the foundation that we're building against that situation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Another thing to think about is helping the person process through what aspects of the loss were out of their control. So a lot of times someone's grief is made worse by circumstances that were out of their control. Maybe they were out of the country when the person died. Maybe they weren't able to attend the funeral, which they feel really guilty about. Maybe they didn't even know that the person was ill and they wish that they would have so that they could spend more time with them. So it's good to help someone kind of process through what types of things made this super challenging for you. And that can be different for everybody, but helping to deconstruct or pull back those layers can help someone kind of compare and contrast what would have made this a more peaceful, honoring experience. What pieces could you have had control over that would have helped you in your grieving process? So that's something to think about as well.
One of the things that I've experienced with my care receivers is that sometimes you need to give these people an idea that in spite of their handicap, they're still valid in terms of serving others. For example, there was a guy who used to do all the handiwork in this church. He had a stroke and his left side was impacted, and not only could he not drive anymore, but he couldn't even get down off the curb to get the mail. So he was not able to get down to the basement where his workshop was, and that was his life. So I decided to find ways to get him involved within the parameters of his abilities so that he could feel he was doing something positive. And it was right before Easter, and I had the church get him a bunch of palms so he could make palm crosses at his kitchen table. So giving these people a valid reason that they're important, that they have something to live for, is important.
Have you guys ever seen the empathy versus sympathy video? This little cartoon that Brené Brown has. So if you go home and YouTube empathy versus sympathy, it's a little cartoon with a bear and a fox-looking thing. And anyway, I'm going to kind of give you the short story, but it's definitely worth watching. I've probably seen it like thousands of times with clients. So in the video, they describe what empathy is and why empathy is important for connection. But they give this little story of someone who's hurting and is stuck in a hole. And then they have a friend come down. It's a little different animal cartoon. And the friend tries to give these at least statements like, well, at least Sarah is still alive even though John has passed. past, or at least your marriage is, still together even though you're struggling, or at least this or that, right? And the cartoon explains why those statements can be so invalidating and unsupportive of someone who's hurting. And so they actually do a really good job describing, sometimes we don't know what to say, and that's okay. That sometimes you can say, I don't even know what to say right now, I'm just so glad you're telling me. And to offer someone connection can do far more than just trying to tell them it's not that bad, right? Trying to give them the silver lining or trying to cheer them up. And I always like to tell people that one of the reasons why we don't want to sit in the pain or the discomfort is because it's uncomfortable for us. So as a minister, thinking about how comfortable are you with grief or loss? What types of things are more uncomfortable for you? So for example, I had a client this week that just came back from deployment. It's the first client I've worked with that has had an active deployment. I've worked with a lot of veterans, but no one that's ever come back right after being abroad. And I realized how painful and emotional that made me. And it wasn't unlike anything I had ever experienced before. So you're going to work with people where the circumstances surrounding their loss or grief might trigger your own or might bring up things for you. And those are things that you want to be mindful of, because your ability to attune or be empathic can be challenged by that. It can be a lot harder to connect with someone when you're sitting in your own pain or you're sitting in your own loss. So you want to be able to explore those things on your own. Because empathy is just meeting someone where they're at, feeling with them, and not trying to steal the limelight. A lot of times, because you had mentioned earlier, we all have experienced depression or grief or loss. A lot of times when someone's talking about their loss, we immediately want to go with, well, I also have lost someone, or this was the circumstance around my situation, or I lost my partner and look how great I'm doing, and there's light at the end of the tunnel. But it's really not about us. It's about meeting that person in their space and accepting them for who they are. And I always joke that when you watch this video, you'll see there's a little cartoon that's down in the hole. And if you've ever been in a relationship with someone or connected with someone who's trying to pull you up out of the hole, what do? You dig your heels in even more, because most of us have a little bit of a stubborn bone, where when someone's saying, come on, get over it, or come on, get out of the hole, or come on, just feel better, we often are like, no, my pain is real, my pain is valid, I don't want to get out of the hole now. So sometimes the quickest way to help someone through is to actually be with them in it, to sit with them, to feel with them, to ache with them, and to not try to pull them or push them up out of their pain.
It's sort of like, I'm here with you, and we'll work on this together.
Yeah.
And you're not going to tell them, I know just how you feel.
Yeah.
Because that's wrong.
Yeah.
That's wrong.
But don't minimize or discredit your own ability.
Right.
I have a lot of people who come in and say, well, if you're not an alcoholic, how can you help me? Or if you've never had children, how can you help me? And so my quick answer to people is that I have all of the education and the knowledge to help you, and you guys have this education and the knowledge to help people through their grieving journey, but you don't have the ownership of their story.
Right.
So I always say, I need you to come forward with your story, and I'll come forward with the education and the knowledge, and we'll meet in the middle.
It's like you don't have to have died in order to help somebody who's facing death.
Yeah.
Now I'd like to do a dangerous thing.
Okay.
Do any of you out there have questions for the good doctor, or even me and Brenda? Yes.
I don't know how to ask the question that will make sense, but there seems to be a lot of younger people committing suicide. Do you, in your professional opinion, think that part of the reason they do it is, number one, they don't understand that death is forever, and number two, because they've been brought up on all the video games and all the media, where even from a little child, all I can think of is the Roadrunner. He keeps running, he gets, and the wolf, whatever, the coyote keeps getting knocked down and should be dead, but pops up again. Do you think that that's influenced the suicide rate in younger people?
Mm-hmm. That's a really good and popular question, as people are essentially saying, is what we're seeing in the media and what kids are being exposed to with technology and video games and TV and Netflix and all of that, is that linking? So I'm probably not going to give the best answer, yes and no. I think research is somewhat inconclusive. We know from experience that everything impacts everything. We live in systems, we live in context, and God is in it all. So the reality is we're influenced by our childhood, we're influenced by our relationships, we're influenced by a bad grade that we got, or something that we watched on TV, or a scary movie. We're influenced by everything. But at the same time, we're not able to exactly predict or connect the dots or correlate, which is a pretty strong research term. Does X lead to Y? So I do think that you have a good point, is that people are influenced, and in some ways we don't quite know what the future will hold. I always like to tell the clients that I work with, the families that I work with, that we're just now figuring out the damage of social media. When it first came out, it was so remarkable and innovative and exciting, and now, 20 years later, we're starting to catch up with research about the number of likes increases the number of depression, and the amount of time scrolling on social media increases the fear of missing out and things like that. So in some ways, I agree that these things that kids are experiencing could certainly be contributing, but in other senses, we don't know for sure. There was a popular TV show that came out a couple years ago called 13 Reasons Why, which was really popular and had to do with the story of a woman who committed suicide, a teen girl, and they actually just this year decided to take out the suicide scene in the first season, because it had such a detrimental effect, and people were citing that. And I had the benefit of going to a conference where there was a couple teams who from a high school actually started the 13 Reasons Why Not project. And what they did, which was really cool, was they met with teens in the high school that were having suicidality or were having thoughts of self-harm, and they actually on the morning announcements told their story. And so then what they would do is they would rally together and they would come up with 13 reasons why I'm not going to do this. And they engaged in this massive research project and found out that people telling their story and contributing to the reasons why, or the people why they're staying on earth, actually helped decrease their depression and their suicidality. So I do think that the media and movies and video games and all of that impacts us, but I don't think it's as crystal clear as we would like it to be. Yeah, that's a good question.
Do we have another question?
It's interesting, though, because it's the same thing you talked about with the older population of telling their story.
Yeah.
So to me, that means as Stephen ministers, the biggest thing we can do is have people tell their story to us.
Yep. Yeah.
Yeah,
People want to be
interesting.
heard. People
Yep.
want to be validated and supported. Yeah.
I have a question.
Yes.
Doctor, you explained earlier there's a difference between grief and depression. And I think I've experienced both. And most of us probably have experienced a grief or a depression. But as a Stephen minister, is it to our benefit or to the benefit of the receiver for us to treat them differently if we qualify them? I'm an ex-salesman. Mm-hmm. We were taught to qualify a customer. Mm-hmm. You don't just jump in and try to sell them something. You talk to them and find out where their likes and dislikes are, then you qualify them
Right.
as a prospect.
Right.
Well, is it the same procedure if you're a Stephen minister and you're dealing with someone who's been through divorce, recent divorce, someone who's just found out they have stage 4 cancer? Do you treat them by qualifying them and then try to direct yourself toward grief or toward depression?
Mm-hmm. That's a good question, too. So what I think is the best case scenario is that you just look out mostly for severe depression. That's the thing that you want to be on guard for. Grief and depression are comorbid, meaning that a lot of times they go hand in hand and you see them together. The thing that we are most concerned about is that idea of clinical depression, which is different from depression or grief. Clinical depression is a diagnosis that will stay with someone regardless of their life circumstances. So like you said, many of us have experienced bouts of depression when we've had transition or loss, and we also probably have experienced grief. But we definitely want to be on guard for those who have major depressive disorder, because they likely need more support than a weekly appointment with you guys. And that's not to undermine the work that you're doing. You're doing fantastic work. But in reality, these people likely need medication or talk therapy or something that's going to help them manage their depression for the rest of their life. So I think that that's a good point of how to delineate and whether it's worthwhile to delineate. When it comes to working with people who don't fall into that major depressive disorder or clinical depression category, it's absolutely appropriate to just say, I need to approach this person with love, with thoughtfulness, with validation, with empathy. Those are all things that are going to be worthwhile regardless of whether they fall into depression or grief. Just be on guard for that clinical depression piece of it.
Now, do you think it's beneficial that a Stephen minister would, in qualifying a receiver, determine their spiritual walk? Because I believe, in my own understanding, I believe that people of faith approach their depression, which they can have, even though they're people of faith, they can have depression or they can have guilt over something. But don't you think that their faith walk has a positive, a more positive reaction? So if you, as a Stephen minister, in qualifying a new receiver that we're just like getting acquainted with as an icebreaker, find out where they are spiritually, so that you can deal with them on a spiritual level as well as a physical level.
Yeah, that's a good question. The way I approach faith or spirituality or religion is as a tool. And so I consider when evaluating someone or working with someone how they can use their faith or spirituality as a resource or a support system. And the reality is we know lots of Christians who are going through the motions, who aren't necessarily diving in or living out their faith in a really authentic way. So I do think it's valuable to evaluate. And I'm going to jump quickly to my specialty, which is working with infidelity. In the same way, when I have a couple come in and they've shared a story of infidelity or betrayal, if they have a faith background, I'll often ask questions. How does your faith make sense of this? What next steps would people in your faith community take? What do you think forgiveness looks like? How do you guys address reconciliation based on your religion or your faith background? So a lot of times in those kinds of sessions, I'm trying to gauge how committed is this person to their faith system so that I can discern whether it will help me inform their treatment. So sometimes I get people who say, well, I go to church every week, but when it comes to the practical relationship with Christ or with the Lord, it's not really there. And so it would be hard to talk with those people, whether it's infidelity or grief, about really trusting the Lord when that hasn't been a thread or a theme for them their whole life. But I do think if they have a strong faith background, that is an asset. That's a tool that you absolutely can use to help them continue to rely on God for support and for strength or for practical next steps.
The other thing about that is that we as Stephen ministers are faith-based as well. And when we have a care receiver who's a C&E Christian, that's Christmas and Easter, we can, using our tools, help them grow in their faith as we work with them, so that our continuing sessions can help lead them to have a greater understanding of what faith is, what faith means, and how it works in their lives, or can work in their lives. Another question. Yes, ma'am.
Can you talk a little bit about heredity and depression, and how we might be able to use the questions about that to help our care receivers?
That's a good question. So the question is, what role does heredity or genetics come into play? So that's actually a challenging component, because without being a therapist, I think that you're somewhat limited in the next step piece of it, right? The writing referrals or the prescriptions or things like that a psychiatrist might be able to do. So a good piece of that you can channel or do is take a family history. So in the therapy world, what we do is called a genogram, and it's just a glorified family tree. And what I do is I ask those types of questions. I ask about a history of depression, bipolar, schizophrenia. Those are the ones that we know pretty clearly have a genetic thread. And so we see them often in families. It's not always every generation, though. Sometimes it skips generations. So it's something to look out for. Did grandma or granddad, did they have schizophrenia, depression, bipolar? But also keep in mind that 50 years ago, people were not diagnosed as routinely as they are now. So someone might say, well, my grandmother had some really rough moments, but she was never really diagnosed with anything. So yes, genetics can play a role in the clinical depression component. For those people, we know through research that some people have a chemical imbalance or an inability for their SSRIs to process. So there is an actual valid component, and that's worthwhile, and those people often need medication or something to help them stabilize. And I know, in different communities we have different views about medication, and I'm not a huge fan of encouraging my clients to get on medication, but what I do explain is that if this is normal, and you're down here or you're up here, sometimes a very basic low-dose medication can get you here so that you can develop and learn the skills to manage your life. And then if you want to go off the medication, you can. But trying to develop skills when you're down here is really difficult. And so sometimes I encourage people, if you want to try it for 6 months or a couple years, and then you get to this range and you learn how to cope, you learn how to exercise and eat healthy and manage difficult life situations, and you want to get off the medication, then you might have a dip, but you have the tools you need to get back to where you need to be. And what I often see is when people are down here, I can throw at them any suggestion in the world and they're not going to receive it because they're just not ready. They're not there. They're so stuck in their pain. Yeah.
More questions?
These are good questions.
I have a question.
Sure.
How do you deal with somebody whose depression is caused by an event that can't be fixed or changed? For example, your only grandson moves to Texas, or you're fired from your job and you're 61 years old, then you're not going to get hired probably by anybody else. In other words, things that you can't grow, develop, or fix.
Mm-hmm. I always encourage people to look for links. So often when someone feels something as a result of a grandchild moving to another state, or job transitions or things like that, they feel something about that because there's another place in their life where they felt it before. So in order to, work through or process through this piece, we need to unpack where are the other times in your life where you felt hopeless or helpless or out of control, or like no one valued you or cared about you. And often when you can get to those roots, when you can peel back the layer, and that's part of the storytelling too, is you'll start to notice themes when people tell their story, right? Themes of loss or themes of joy or themes of triumph. And when you can peel back the layers and look at those themes, you can help someone, well, in the therapy world, we call it deconstruct or re-narrate their current position. So rather than look at a grandchild moving to Texas as a tragedy, they can look at it as a celebration of their family, that someone felt safe enough to leave the nest and to go do great things in the world. And often we have to kind of process through those family narratives and those family stories that we have held on to for so long.
So would it be valid to say that depression in a large part is mainly due to somebody who feels like they've lost control of their lives?
That's a good question. So again, if we're taking out or delineating that clinical depression piece, where it does have a lot to do with the chemical imbalance in the body, most of the people that experience a situational depression or a temporary period of depression feel a loss of control. They feel like life has happened to them and they've had no agency, and that has led to pain.
Yeah. Do we have any other questions? You got any final thoughts, Ms. Consorto?
I just appreciate everything
Yeah.
you've shared with us. I know I took a lot from today, and I'm hopeful everybody else did, so thank you very much.
Thanks
Yes.
for having me.
Well, I want to thank you so much for being here today. It's a Saturday and we're impinging on your family time.
That's okay.
And I want to thank you for your expertise, and I want to thank you for sharing your grandmother with us.
Of course.
And I'm impressed that you didn't have to refer to your notes even once.
There we go.
So, this is Trinity Lutheran Church Stephen Ministry Workshop. The subject was depression, and I have great faith that since this topic was discussed, none of us are walking out of here depressed.
Oh, you're so quick-witted.
It's a curse.
Thanks for having me. Oh, goodness. Thank you.
Thank you.
In your word we will follow.